About a month ago, I tackled a smaller developer known as Yames, and in this video we discussed the idea of exploring horror games in a non-conventional way. Rather than run from the monster, in Yames' games we often went looking for said creature. The whole idea around these games was discovery, and how that said discovery leads into the unnerving scenarios the player would find themselves in. Today we'll be looking at another developer that takes those same concepts but goes in a completely different direction, and her name is Kitty Horror Show. Under a microscope, Yames' most popular games, Discover My Body and Water Womb World, have one very common idea, that being the discovery of something horrific in a more structured and calculated environment. Discover My Body has a college student note the change of another scientist in a safe lab, while the player in Water Womb World has tons of equipment and provisions for their journey into the watery abyss. These situations can be deemed unsafe due to the outcome, but there is definitely a backing and some comfort for the player is given. The scientist in Discover My Body is overly friendly, even post his first transformation, and the submerged lab in Water Womb World is a place for the player to relax, analyze their findings, and restock on resources. Kitty Horror Show does a similar discovery idea, but in a far more naked and abstract way. Instead of having a blanket of normalcy, that being the civilized world with a written backstory, Kitty Horror Show often thrusts the player into empty worlds with no directions and some sort of malicious intent in mind. Take for example Scarlet Bow. We are left on a dock in a Silent Hill-esque town. The player is given no objective, but can discover and interact with a small number of items. These coffins, broken mirrors, batteries that go into this generator, this thing, and lastly, notes left from a time past. These environmental cues put the player on edge until after enough time passes and the game shows its true colors. This formula works well, shoving the player somewhere with no immediate objective and having them discover what lies in wait on their own and usually with no NPC guidance. Isolation is a powerful tool to make humans paranoid. After all, we are inherently social creatures. So let's take a look at the techniques Kitty Horror Show uses to incite that very fear. Lighting in any horror game is usually scarce. Not being able to see what's in front of you makes your mind run wild with possibilities, and Kitty Horror Show games take this concept to the extreme. Your field of view is usually limited whether the game takes place in broad daylight or not. Mix this limited view with a completely alien world and low poly graphics, and the player can easily have their senses running with possibilities. The music is usually a toss-up of three types of sounds: a low-key song that's on the more goofy side of things, a mishmash of sounds that are put into a general beat or rhythm, or lastly an oppressive, overbearing sound that just feels malicious. What I found most entertaining about these games is the fact that I was constantly alt-tabbing out of my game, despite the fact that in every single game besides one, the player never actually encounters a monster. Instead, visual and audio tricks end up preying on your mind. Again, you're pretty much always on your own with the mix of darkness and a little bit of storytelling. It's very hard to get comfortable. What's more is that depending on the game, moods can swap on a dime, and they often will when the player gets close to the game's conclusion. This means that the quiet and lonely dread we experience gets pushed to the side with an over-the-top and loud conclusion, complete with new visuals. I think this idea is predictable, a build-up into an explosion of tension. Most horror games do this same concept, but it's done so well because the player is left alone for such a long time, and the build-up lasts for pretty much the majority of the game. The basics and fundamentals of a horror game are all here: lighting, sound, and gameplay, but what ultimately makes these games good is what comes from Kitty Horrorshow herself. All of the topics I have covered so far are pretty much no-brainers. Building tension, proper lighting, and clear sound design, these are all things good horror games tend to have in common. But ideas. Horror games normally don't share too many ideas unless they are a spiritual successor or blatant plagiarism. But Kitty Horrorshow has tons of ideas. She makes a lot of small games, all tackling different and unique topics. In fact, downloading any of her Haunted Cities packs comes with about 3 to 4 games, all set in different worlds. This is no easy task, especially since she's doing it alone, and it makes the amount of ideas she comes up with truly impressive. And those very same ideas are what make Kitty Horrorshow shine. Kitty Horrorshow games often tackle abstract and frankly creative ideas. One of my favorite examples of this was in a game called 00000FF0000, which I'll just name Oof for now on. But after downloading Oof and unpacking this game, the player then has to traverse its files, locate the game through junk folders, isolate the game in a separate folder, and only then are you allowed to play. What follows is a game that specifically tells you it doesn't want you there, and the game implies that it's actively hurting to be running, which would explain why it was hiding itself and trying not to be opened in the first place. Self-aware AI and characters get brought up a few more times as well. In Gloompuke Castle, all the characters question why they can't move, and when asked what they know about the history of the world you're exploring, they don't have any answers to give you. This is because their existence has only been around as long as the player has ran the game. A lot of her other games are created with the express purpose of just exploration. For example, Ghost Lake has the player drive around a map, collect small bits of dialogue, and soak in the scenery. There's another form of self-awareness with the bubble directly talking to the player rather than the character, but that's just there to creep you out. All of these odd game designs doesn't mean she isn't capable of making a standard map with a narrative to explore. She does this perfectly well with Monastery. The player explores a seemingly abandoned monastery and slowly finds clues and notes as to what went down. The most compelling aspect of this game is not only the narrative, but the fact that the player can check up on this front door throughout the game, and the current status of the world will change until ultimately a twist happens near the end. My point here is that Kitty Horrorshow is full of interesting ideas, some that aren't even scary, like exploring roads and slowly uncovering a love story hidden in bottles. But what she does best is isolating you, then making you think of the possibilities that are in the dark because of the uncomfortable nature her narratives produce. Her ability to make seemingly anything scary is a real strength, and one that is shown off no more perfectly than in Anatomy. If you've seen anything from Kitty Horrorshow, then it was most certainly Anatomy. I would argue Anatomy is the amalgamation of everything Kitty has shown us up to this point put into one game. Incredibly dark hallways, an objective that has us explore our environment, and clear haunting sound effects that make your footsteps sound like you're stomping around with concrete blocks attached to your feet. This has the makings of a standard Kitty horror game, but there's something new here. A pre-recorded voice that simply theorizes how a house is quite similar to the human body, comparing how the living room is much like a human heart. How the human heart pumps blood, the living room has human beings actively walking in and out of it, since it's usually the centralized point in a house. How the bedroom is like a brain, since both our brain and where we sleep is the starting point of dreams. These comparisons get more dark and grotesque until I'm not going to tell you, because I believe this game is worth every cent of your time, and considering it's a $2 purchase, I don't think there's too much of a barrier to play this game. It really is a special experience, and one I think should be played rather than watched, since the haunting atmosphere really gets to shine when you're behind the controls. Overall, I think Kitty Horror Show does an excellent job of getting the player out of any comfort zone. By forcing progression through exploration of unsettling and quiet worlds, we get to experience a different kind of dread. Again, like Yames's games, it's one that doesn't have you run away from creatures. Instead, we look for it, even if it means our certain doom, or just a mildly uncomfortable experience. I want to thank you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you consider subscribing, and I hope you guys have a good day.